Good morning, boys and girls. Today, our read aloud, we are going to read Thank You, Mr. Falker by Patricia Polacco. In this story is about a little girl named Trish. She's faced with a difficult time while learning how to read. The author uses some really great language to tell her story. Let's lean in and think about what the author really means when she uses fantastic language. The grandpa held a jar of honey so that the family could see, then dipped the ladle into it and drizzled honey on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. "Stand up, little one," he cooed. "I did this for your mother, your uncles, your older brother, and now you." Then he handed the book to her. "Taste." She dipped her fingers into the honey and put it into her mouth. "What is that taste?" the grandpa asked. The little girl answered, "Sweet." Then all the family said in a single voice, "Yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made the sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of the book." The little girl knew that the promise to read was at last hers. Soon she was going to learn to read. I want to think. What does knowledge is like a bee that made that sweet honey you have to chase it through the pages of a book? I'm thinking that the author meant something big here. Knowledge is like the bee that made that sweet honey you have to chase it through the pages of the book. What does the author mean that knowledge is a bee? No, I think it means that you have to work for knowledge. You have to go after knowledge the way you chase a bee. Sometimes authors say things but mean another thing. Trisha, the little girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher, mother, read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his book home for school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, the grandfather and grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all, she hoped to read. Each day she saw the kids in the first grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. Not Trisha. Still, she loved being at school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her do her magic with the crayons. "In first grade, you'll learn to read," her brother said. In the first grade, Trisha sat in a circle with the other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood, their, their first reader. Sounding out letters and words, they said, ba, 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 bo, boy, and look. The teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and got a word right. But when Trisha looked at the page, all she saw were wiggling shapes. And when she tried to sound out the words, the other kids laughed at her. "Trish, what are you looking at in that book?" they said. "I'm reading," she said back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person, always when it was her turn to read. Her teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the kids moved up into the second reader and third reader, and stayed alone in our she stayed alone in our neighborhood. Trish began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. The harder words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. How she loved to draw, or just sitting and dreaming, or she could going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandmother were walking together in the small woods behind their farm. It was twilight. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grasses. As they walked, Trish said, "Grandma, do you think I'm different?" "Of course," her grandma answered. "To be different is the miracle of life. You see, all of those little fireflies, everyone is different. Do you think I'm smart?" Trish didn't feel smart. Her grandmother hugged her. "You're the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever." Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading didn't matter so much. Trisha's grandmother used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be on the other side, where the light comes from. One evening they laid on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. "You know," her grandma said, "all of us will go there someday, hanging on to the grass, or you'll lift right off the ground, and there you'll be." They laughed and both hung on to the grass. It was not long after the night that her grandmother must have let go of the grass, because she went to where the lights were on the other side. And not long after, Trisha Grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. Hmm. Hang on to the grass or you'll lift right off the ground. And there you'll be. Hmm. Do you think the author meant that you would really lift off the ground? Using what you know about the story, what does she mean and how do you know? Take 1 minute to think about it. Hang onto the grass and you'll lift right off the ground, and there you'll be. I think that the author is trying to say that when you're on the ground, you're on earth. But then the author was also talking about that the lights from heaven. So maybe she's referring to when you lift off the ground, there you'll be. Maybe the author's referring to heaven, that people lift off the ground and go to heaven. Now, if I look at paragraph 3, the author is using some great language to tell us what happened. I'm going to stop and jot what I think the author means here. What is she trying to tell us? She said, "But it was not long after the night that Grandma must have let go of the grass, because she went to where the lights were on the other side." So I know that the other side of where the lights are, there were lights of heaven coming from the other side. So I think the author is trying to say, and I'm going to stop and jot my thinking. I think the author's trying to say here that Grandma must have went to heaven. So when someone goes to heaven, when people use that reference, I know that they mean that grandma passed away, she died. Grandma passed away. Okay, let's continue reading. Reading was just a plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page and Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trish would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that wasn't happening to hers. The numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. Line the numbers up before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Trish tried, the numbers looked like a sack of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She just knew she was dumb. Then one day her mother announced that she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and brother moved across the county in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over words. The cat ran. She was reading like a baby in the third grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Tricia for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. "Hey, dummy," a boy called out to her on the playground. "How come you're so dumb?" Other kids stood near him and they laughed. Tricia could feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Now Tricia wanted to go to school less and less. "I have a sore throat," she'll say to her mother, or "I have a stomach ache." She dreamed more and more and drew more and more. She hated school. Then when Tricia started 5th grade, school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teacher pets gathered around him. Stevie Joe and Alice Marie, Davy and Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Trish whenever she was drawing and whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings. But they still laughed whenever she gave the wrong answer. Then one day she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through the page of Charlotte's Web. The page was going all fuzzy. When the kids began to laugh out loud, Mr. Falker, in his plain jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop! You are all of you so perfect that you can't look at another person and find fault with her?" That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except Eric. He had sat behind Tricia for 2 whole years, but he seemed almost to hate her. Tricia didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her and pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground, leaned in her face, and called her Toad. Trish was afraid to turn any corner for fear Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who teased her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Trisha, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her in the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom and to jump out and call her stupid or ugly, and Trisha began to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide underneath the inside stairwell during the free time and not have to go outside at all. In the dark place, she felt completely safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. Have you become a mole? He laughed. And then he pulled her out of the hall and danced around her. Dumbbell, dumbbell, magadi old dumbbell. Trisha buried her head in her arms and curled up in a ball. Suddenly she heard the footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office. When he came back, he found Trisha. I don't think you'll have to worry about that boy again, he said softly. What was he teasing you about, little one? I don't know, Trisha shrugged. Trisha was sure Mr. Falker believed that she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence. Then she'll say the same thing he did. Good, he would say. Then one day Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and help watch the blackboards. He put on music and bought out little sandwiches so they worked and talked. All at once he said, Let's play a game. I'll shout out letters and you write them on the board with a wet sponge as quickly as you can. A, he shouted. She wiped a watery A. 8, he shouted. She made a watery 8. 14, 3, DMK, he shouted. He shouted out many, many letters and numbers. Then he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Trisha knew that none of the letters or numbers looked like they should. She threw the sponge down and tried to run. But Mr. Falker caught her arm and sank to his knees in front of her. You poor baby, he said. You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so lonely and afraid, he sobbed. But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters and numbers the way other people do. And you've gotten through school all this time and fooled many, many good teachers. He smiled at her. That took cunning and smartness and such bravery. Then he stood up and finished watching the board. You're going to change all that, girl. You are going to read. I promise you that. Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Pelsley, a reading teacher. They did a lot of things she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in sand, and then big sponge circles in a blackboard, going from left to right. Another day, they flicked letters on a screen, and Trish shouted them out. Still other days, she worked with wooden blocks and built words, letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out. And that felt good. But though she'd read words, she hadn't read a whole sentence. And deep down, she still felt dumb. And then one spring day, it had been 3 months or 4 months since they had started. Mr. Falker put the book in front of her. She'd never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of the page and pointed to it, almost as if it were magic, or as if light poured into her brain. The words and sentences started to take shape on the page as they had and never had before. She marched them off to. Slowly she read the sentence. then another and another, and finally she'd read a paragraph, and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Pelsley had tears in their eyes. That night, Trish ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open her front door, and ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up the cupboard and grabbed a jar of honey. Hmm, I'm going to stop here because I see a word that I have to do some thinking to understand what the author's trying to say. She bounded up the front steps, drew open her front door, and ran through the dining room table. I'm going to do some thinking about the word bounded. I can tell from the sentence that she's moving fast because she throws the door open and run through the dining room table. This makes me believe that she ran up the front steps, faced, or maybe leaped up the front steps. So I think that's what they meant, what the author meant when she used the word bounded. Let's continue reading. Then she went into the living room and found the book on a shelf, of the very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned honey on the cover and tasted the sweetness that and said to herself, "The honey's sweet, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of the book." That's what her grandpa had taught her. Then she held the book of honey and all close to her chest. She could feel tears run down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. She was happy, so very happy. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know that because that little girl was me, Patricia Polacco. I saw Mr. Falker again some 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and introduced myself. At first, he had difficulty placing me. Then I told him who I was and how he changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me and asked me what I did for a living. "Why, Mr. Falker," I answered. "I make books for children." "Thank you, Mr. Falker. Thank you." What a great book, boys and girls.